Okay, Oscar, I've made you host and the recording seems to be continuing, so that's a good start.
Perfect.
So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining this conversation on gender transformative education. This is a joint initiative between Professors Without Borders and two students from the MBA in Educational Leadership from Tampere University. And I'm going to let Tessy start by introducing all of our speakers. And then Oscar will continue by presenting the topic for today. So Tessy, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gender Transformative Education panel today to honor the International Day of the Girl. My name is Tessy Antony de Nassau, and I'm the co-founder and president of Professors Without Borders. We work in 21 countries around the world, and having partnerships such as the one today is vital for us to spread our work, spread our intelligence, meet with new people, and work with incredible speakers as we will have today. Without further ado, let me introduce you to the speakers of today. I will start with introducing the co-host, Oscar Boyege. Please correct me, Oscar, if I pronounce your name wrongly. He is an education specialist at UNICEF in Bangladesh, experienced with children and youth rights, MBA student of educational leadership. Oscar, it is a pleasure to have you here today, and thank you so much for this beautiful partnership. We are very grateful of Professor Borders. Also, we have Dr. Caroline Warren, who has said hello to you first. She is my co-founder at Professor Borders and also the most amazing CEO. So welcome, Caroline. Let me introduce you now to the three speakers. Let me start with the male in the round. Sven Botha is an assistant lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Prior to his appointment as an assistant lecturer, Sven served as a tutor and head tutor in the department. His teaching includes the militarization of politics and international law and gender, amongst other areas in political science and international relations. He has worked and published on the following areas: terrorism, counterterrorism, gender, foreign policy, diplomacy, security issues in the global south, as well as early career development in the social sciences. Sven, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Little disclaimer, I'm sorry if you hear my baby, he's next to me. We just landed in the UK. So he will be joining the lecture introduction as well and says hello to everyone. Then we have Jana Naujoks, is an experienced conflict, peace building and gender advisor. She was the head of programs at Inclusive Peace with a focus on WPS. Previously, she was working on peace building, gender in peace and security, international cooperation, project coordination and financial management for International Alert for over a decade. She spent 5 years in Myanmar working as gender advisor and later country director for International Alert Myanmar. Jana, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for making the time. Last but definitely not least, we have MANDY SANGHERA, which is also a dear friend of mine. MANDY is an award-winning philanthropist and global campaigner, often referred to as a global catalyst. As well as being an international human rights activist and motivational TEDx speaker from UK, MANDY has traveled all over the world, empowering and motivating others. With over 3 decades of experience, MANDY is an expert in various development-related fields. She has been driving innovation, building strategic partnerships, promoting advocacy and programming in the areas of human rights, gender equality, accountability, and social justice globally. MANDY, it is a pleasure to have you here today. I know you're traveling as well and speaking at other conferences in between our panel today. So really, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So let me tell you a little bit of our focus at Professors Without Borders, which relate to the conference here today. Education is crucial for transforming norms, raise awareness, and building critical thinking skills. Gender transformative education is an emerging trend that is relevant to our Women in Higher Education and Access initiatives at Professors Without Borders. We are talking about gender transformative education. So is it innovation or a buzzword? Standing has stated that nobody trying to be influenced can afford to neglect the fine art of buzzwords. It's a quote from Standing 2001. And the same can also be said to apply to the international development sector. Gender transformative approaches, gender transformative education, comprehensive sexual education, humanitarian development nexus, and others are amongst the latest buzzwords the international community is utilizing to draw renewed attention to, among other, gender equality and related objectives. But is there actually anything new in these terms and concepts, or are they simply an attempt by the sector to reward existing concepts that have been emptied of meaning or that require rebranding and relaunching in order to attract new donors' interests and government commitments? Couldn't, for example, gender mainstreaming in education also have been assessed to contribute towards transforming society and contributing towards gender equality through education? These and other questions will be discussed during the Gender Transformative Education webinar today, which we will be starting shortly. Before that, very quickly, Oscar then will now take over from me. He will introduce the background of our discussion today in full and share the guiding definitions which are crucial to define that we will be using today. So that is all for me today. Thank you so much for joining our conference. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Caroline. And over to you, Oscar. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tessy. So, yes. So the notion, like the idea of gender being a social construct is relatively new. I mean, in the sense that only from the 70s, it was brought into, academics and research. Before this, the notion of just, biological sexes was the one that was being used. So considering that it's only been approximately 50 years or so that we've had these concepts of gender as a social construct, we have had quite a lot of progress, I believe, during that time in terms of there has really been a focus and an emphasis on positive discrimination towards women and girls. In all kind of sectors, including in international development. But still, of course, there's a long way to go. And I think what we're seeing now with the introduction of gender transformative approaches in education is there's a need for even more in-depth work that has been done in the past. And I think this is an interesting aspect of this conversation that we're going to have today on, how deep can we go and what kind of challenges we will face when we, dive even deeper, into the definitions of, the diverse range of genders and so on. So gender transformative approaches, you can see on the screen, this definition by Marcus and others. So gender transformative approaches aim to address the structural and social root causes of gender inequality and thereby promote more equitable outcomes, in this case for children in all the diversity. And maybe here to highlight, the root causes being maybe, we have been tackling a lot of symptoms of gender inequality in the past, but maybe now is the time to really go and look into the root causes and who can contribute towards tackling the root causes of gender inequality. And the last words there, children in all their diversity. So moving away from the notion of only girls and boys, but also, other types of genders and so on. So that's kind of the umbrella for gender and transformative approaches. And then, education would be kind of like a subsector to it. That education also contributes to gender transformation or the notion of gender transformation. So here, the definition that we're screening, putting on the screen is the one by UNICEF and Plan International, which basically, looks at education. Seeking for education to utilize all parts of an education system to transform stereotypes, attitudes, norms, and practices by challenging power relations, rethinking gender norms and binaries, and raising critical consciousness to about the root causes of inequality and systems of oppression. So again, if we just, just in other words, would be utilizing the education system in order to battling or tackling gender inequality, like that is happening not only in the classroom or not happening only in the schools or in university, but actually in society. So utilizing education to transform society into being more equal. So I think maybe that's I leave it at that. We had posed some questions in this background note that we have drafted, which we have also shared. And yeah, but before maybe we go into more of those details, I think we're going to pass the word to our speakers to just any introduction comments from based on this introduction or the background note and so on. After which we can then go into more questions. Yeah. Do I hand over to Tessy or another speaker?
No, now you can hand over to the speakers. You can moderate the speakers and ask the questions.
Okay, thank you. No particular order. Jana, I wonder if you would be interested in just bringing in your thoughts on, the introduction on these definitions that we have used, that UNICEF and Plan International, for example, uses. And yeah, your thoughts on gender transformative education and, like this new trend within the sector.
Thank you for this good introduction and the question. Yes, I think I would pretty much agree with most of this definition. So I'm getting some feedback. I hope that's not too loud. There is, sorry, the feedback's been bad. What's important to me about this definition is this going back to the root causes of gender inequality, because I think this is something that often gets overlooked when we talk superficially about some of the more cosmetic efforts to work towards gender equality. And I think one of the words that sticks out to me also from the introduction was the mention of positive discrimination efforts, which I think can sometimes distract and cause backlash actually against the positive interventions that are taking place, because it kind of turns the idea on its head rather than trying to overcome some of these structurally entrenched discriminatory practices and attitudes by distracting from it. So I think it's really important that we look at how the current system perpetuates maybe unequal practices and inequalities, discrimination against some of the members of our society based on their gender identities, and about the intersecting with other identities as well, which I think is what also comes out of that part of the quote that you mentioned around children in all their diversity. I think it's children and adults of all generations and in all their diversity that we cannot look at only as from a gender perspective, but also have to look at how other identity factors intersect with that. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm happy to come in. So I would say that I agree with everything Jana has said, but I also would say that in some parts of the world, in like the global south and in Africa, young women are victims of early child forced marriage and other harmful practices and pulled out of school. We've seen during the pandemic that a lot of young girls have not gone back to school. So all of those inequalities, and we've seen, women are fighting for equal pay and for equality already, and it's gone back further. And it's about how do we kind of look at addressing that. And actually, I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I think, Jana, the points that you made about intersectionality, looking at not just gender, but ethnicity, disability, and all those other things, and how do we kind of address all of those in a classroom and at a school and an education system.
Thank you so much, Mandy.
Sven? Could you take away just the question so we can see the speakers in full glory when they speak? That would be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. I just want to make sure that I'm audible. Yes, all right. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this very interesting and timely discussion. Look, I'm not a country director. I'm going to come at this from a slightly more academic perspective, from a pedagogical perspective. And that is to say that I agree with the definition in its essence. But I think it's important for us to remember that this process of gender transformative education is a journey and not a destination, because there are various processes, various stereotypes and various realities that we have to challenge, various realities that we have to change. So I think first and foremost, I would have liked to have seen something that emphasizes the importance of this being a systemic or progressive movement, as opposed to something that we should try and achieve. There definitely needs to be elements of a systemic approach. That's the one thing. The other thing that I would have liked to have seen more of is this idea of accommodating both the individual and the collective narrative. So, you know, on an individual level, I think it's good to maybe have insights and discussions as to, okay, how can I implement this as an educator? How can I implement gender transformative ideas as an educator? But then again, looking at the collective whole, how can we take this forward together? Because there are various interlinkages that we have to form. You know, we have to go from a primary level education to secondary level education to tertiary level education. So I think the definition itself could be a bit broader. And it could accommodate the various nuances and the various actors within the space. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Oscar.
Thank you so much for these great first thoughts and reactions to the definitions and to the topic. Actually, one of the points that MANDY made was one that I was also discussing with some colleagues earlier, related to the fact, I mean, yes, post-COVID or present COVID, we're not necessarily over it yet. There has been some regression made, you know, in terms of like gender equality, you know, like opportunities for girls, you know, when it comes to education and so on. At the same time, you know, these global organizations, you know, within the UN and others are pushing for, you know, even more progressive and what do you say, you know, like dimensions of gender. And I wonder, you know, like if it's the right time, you think, you know, like, or if we're moving too fast, as was also like mentioned, you know, if we should still focus, you know, like on the core elements, you know, like what has been actually the focus the last few decades, you know, like the genders, you know, like boys and girls, or is it the right time to bring in also the third dimension? I mean, like the third gender, you know, like, and then, you know, the whole aspect, you know, root causes for the third gender and so on. So I wonder if anybody would like to comment on that.
Well, I think, you know, like UN Women have, you know, goals and targets to achieve gender equality by 2030. Like we have all the UN goals, and we're in the decade for action now. We have less than 8 years to kind of achieve that. And I think it's been very difficult to have certain conversations. I think if you look on social media and other platforms more recently, when people want to talk about different genders, for instance, it's quite difficult for people to have that space. And I think, you know, for me, there's been a lot of conversations, even in the UK right now, the government around the gender recognition bill and all those different things about you know, what is a woman and all of these things. And actually people are not focusing on some of the other issues around the equality, all those things that people have been fighting for such a long time, because sometimes we get very sort of pulled into a different direction and not able to really have a very honest conversation. And I think it's kind of really is about talking about the elephant in the room. And it's about young people. We've seen things here in the UK right now, you know, certain places have been taken to court and things like that around young people. And it's about looking at how do we support young people and how do we kind of have this very difficult conversation. So, and, you know, what role do teachers play within addressing some of those inequalities and around gender? I'd be quite keen to hear from others as well.
If I can quickly
go ahead.
I think the same thing, Sven, actually. Putting on the academic hat here, there is a concern of who is moderating this conversation. What do they know about the issue, and how do we get them to moderate the conversation in a way that is mature and constructive? And of course, that requires resources, that requires knowledge, that requires training by the right people. And this has to be done with a certain amount of cultural sensitivity, depending, to acknowledge the realities of each of the places where these issues are being taught. So it's a very complex, difficult transformation that needs to take place. But I would argue that it originates very much, not actually with the policymakers, but with the teachers. Because they are the conductors of this conversation, that not just the moderators, but the instructors. I think it's the same with everything else around education. But in this case, we're talking about a very emerging trend, something that's quite new. So how do we communicate this in the best way through the best mediums? Sven, I imagine that you're going to jump on that one.
Well, since you've laid the groundwork so nicely, I might as well. And I'll state up front that I have a postgraduate group that I teach now on a yearly basis, starting this year and again next year, and hopefully the year after that, in a module titled Gender and Politics. And it basically covers the intersection or the nexus between gender and political science and international relations. So we look at various issues that range from gender and political leadership to gender and policy making, to gender and conflict resolution, to gender and technology, you name it, we've got it. And I found that one of the, I think, most challenging aspects of my role as a teacher is to create, first of all, a safe space where people can come and say, this is how I identify, how can I get the best that I can out of this particular program. And I think that the second problem, or not problem, the second challenge that I face is creating a space where we don't only have conversations around activism, we also have proper conversations around conceptual, methodological, and theoretical debates, and how these debates interact with the real world and the grassroots level. Because a lot of the students that I have taught, and a lot of the students that I have assisted over time often come to me because they are advocates, or they've had something happen to them in the past, and they think that this module will help them in becoming a better advocate. And yes, to a certain extent that is true, but I also have to ensure as an educator that I teach them how to use gender as a unit of analysis in their research, whether that be on a conceptual, methodological, or theoretical level. And that means taking a more inclusive approach and saying, we all have a gender to some extent. I have a gender, you have a gender. How do we incorporate this into the discourse? And I often argue, I then say to them, let's do it this way, right? Let's acknowledge that the genders, various genders, whether they be male, female, or something else, all have different interests and different needs. And before you can make a recommendation of any kind, you have to understand what those different interests and needs are. And this is where I try to teach them the practical skills of actually doing a gendered analysis. So for example, if we are doing a, let's say, post-conflict scenario where rape has been used as a weapon of war, there's a minority ethnic group involved, we give them we use games teaching, and we give them a scenario. And I say, okay, now with that information, let us do a gendered analysis on both, men and women, and see how the recommendations and how the realities are different. And I find that yields some very interesting results, because they go from having this very staunch activism hat to having a more sort of researcher hat. And I'm not throwing shade on the activists. I think we do need them, but at the same time, we need to have this inclusive approach so that we have proper impact, that we have meaningful impact. And so, yeah, for me, this has really been an education in itself, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing it again in the years that follow.
I pick up on a few of those points. What really resonated with me was Caroline's point about sort of who speaks the message, and that's something that I think I've come across a lot when trying to support change kind of challenging some of the gender norms in a quite challenging setting, for example, in military setting when dealing with military leaders or dealing with community elders or kind of elder forest governance officials who are very unfamiliar with this kind of approach. And I certainly realized what limitations I, as a woman, or I as a kind of European woman would have in this context, and then who speaks the message is much more important for what learning experience or what reflection is possible for the stakeholders in the room. So I think from some of the community level programming there, we found it very effective to try to have some of these discussions and reflections in different groups, sort of identity level groups, sex and age disaggregated, because it's very different, the environment in which you can have this personal reflection. And that goes back to the earlier point as well, I think, around the systemic nature and sort of needing this interaction between the personal, the individual, and how gender has shaped all of our lives and our expectations, our families' expectations, the social expectations we face, compared to how some of the systems and procedures reproduce these rules and norms and expectations and hierarchies. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Or maybe the other point I wanted to pick up on was this question on gender and sort of whether there's a step-by-step gender process. Do we need to start with women's rights before we can then broaden out into diverse sexual orientations and gender identities? And there I would just say as well that some of the heteronormativity that we have seen also was quite reinforced through various colonial codified practices, and in different communities we can see very different indigenous forms and practice. So I'm not sure whether it's necessarily about having one first, having women's rights or equality before you can then start to unpack other issues. This is of course vastly different where we're looking at different places in Africa, maybe South Asia, where there's different forms that are currently being practiced as well. And then it could be more about highlighting some of these indigenous kind of non-binary experiences and practices and traditions and celebrating those as well. And from a pedagogical approach, I always find that slightly, if you're looking at challenging gender norms and sort of these prisons of gender expectations, then does it need to be about breaking only the sort of male versus females, or is it easier if we actually just say, let's throw out those categories altogether, let's look at human beings without necessarily defining what is a good man or a good woman and sort of what are these expectations? Can we just focus on the human and spend less time putting people into categories and what is acceptable, what is not acceptable? And that also then kind of throws out some of these binary expectations and challenges that we then find.
I think that's a really good point, because actually one of the things is it depends on where you are in the world. You might be able to have that conversation quite openly in Europe and in the UK, but actually if we went to somewhere in the MENA region, we may not be able to have such an honest conversation. Young people may not be able to come out and talk about their sexuality openly because of honor and culture and all those other practices and labels that we're probably going to talk about. So it is about having a create safe space. It's about people being able to identify themselves safely. But as somebody who's traveled and worked around the world, I've seen that a lot of people will not come forward and talk about, what they identify themselves as. And last year I did a lot of evacuations from Afghanistan, and a lot of the young people were just, kind of denying their gender and whatever else because they were so worried about the consequences. So I just think it's about us being a bit sensitive and understanding our audience and kind of where we are, and sometimes students come from a different culture and it's quite difficult for them to have that kind of be open and honest.
Sorry, might I just jump on that if the moderator will allow? And Mandy, I completely agree with you. And if I can just relate it back to my context, we had a statistic a couple of years ago. Let's actually look it up and see how relevant it is still. But there was a statistic that was circulating that said every 4 minutes in South Africa, a woman gets raped. And so I think to solely focus on the human being is sometimes a utopian idea. That's not to say I don't agree with it. I think it's a wonderful idea in its own right. But, dealing with these students and getting through to them is fundamental. And I think, the first port of call when you try to get through to a student who has sort of an activist lens or an activist mindset is to say, okay, well, why are you here? Why did you take this particular course? What is it that brought you here? Because many of them will have something in their background that brought them here. And funnily enough, when I looked at my student evals, there was one person who wrote, this course has helped me to define my role as a woman in international relations. And I found that to be quite significant, because we had this, this one individual, and I had a good idea of who it might have been, but she had this notion of wanting to go into diplomacy. You spoke about the evacs in Afghanistan. That would have been her backyard, so to speak, her wheelhouse, but she did not know how to go about it. And I think, if you can give somebody the building blocks, then one can have a tremendous amount of impact. But I think in order to do that, you first need to understand them as a human being, but we have to understand that understanding will sometimes rest on personal experiences. And so we cannot, that are gendered, or that are racialized, or that are, inclined towards a certain ethnic group or a disability or whatever. So as much as we need to focus on the human being, it's also important to focus on the contextual basis of what drives somebody to do something or to believe in something. Because I think if you understand your audience better, you can drive them towards that particular goal, that particular understanding further down the line. So I think that there's room for both here if we balance them out.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation. I think we've focused a lot on the gender aspect of gender transformative education. So let me push you on the transformative aspect. How do we reach a situation, and is it even desirable? I mean, this is a new trend, so it can be contentious whether or not you agree that this is a desirable direction. But if it were, how do you see achieving a transformation in this normative concept of gender, assuming it is the normative concept? And is education the right means to do that? And let me push you a little bit further on that. You mentioned differences of being able to communicate around this issue depending on where you are geographically. So if you want this transformation, does it necessarily have to come from environments already more open to this conversation? And then you hope that it trickles down through osmosis? Does it mean that we completely ignore the conversation in places where it's more difficult to be had? How do we expect this transformation to take place in the places that need it the most?
I think you've really made a really valid point, because actually, I mean, it's great to say that we could learn from others that are doing it well, but actually we need to go into those areas, part of the world where, women are still fighting for equality, still fighting for equal pay, still fighting for right, fighting for gender, fighting gender-based violence every single day. I don't think there's a one fit solution for everything. I think that we've got to sort of work in a person-centered way. We've got to look at the countries that we have. It's about sending those messages, but actually then if we're doing something in Europe, then actually bringing partners from the global south and Africa to the table and sharing our expertise and knowledge and offering peer support, maybe, I don't know, that's just what I would think.
Absolutely. No, I agree. Sorry, I don't mean to talk over the moderator, but I completely agree. I think sharing best practice is definitely one way to go. And I definitely think that putting those best practices into some sort of pedagogical toolkit or framework could work exceptionally well. I mean, just to give you a basic example, if I can refer back to my own context, right? I am basically the only academic member of staff in this department that focuses on gender, and I'm a male. So I basically got a double-edged sword in the sense that I'm on the wrong team, some would say, but then I'm also, swimming upstream alone, or pretty much most of the time. So I think that would help. But I don't necessarily think that this needs to be something that can come from the top and trickle down. I think this is also something where we can work with potential at a grassroots level and try and connect the two in the middle somewhere, because this is where it brings me back to my previous point at the very beginning, where I said, the definition is not broad enough in the sense that it should have both, an individual aspect and a cohesive aspect, because I think wherever you are in the world, there will be somebody that doesn't conform with, their version of reality. And I think it's very important to tap into those networks. It's very important to try and work with them as much as you can, because the moment you are able to transition into that society and give them an alternative viewpoint, that contact will be absolutely crucial, because they will be able to prompt you in the right direction and say, okay, look, these are our cultural prompts. If you want to get somewhere with somebody, consider doing X, Y, and Z before you breach the subject. Or if we're going to have a so-called data party to analyze results of an evaluation or of an intervention, we need to make sure that we've got persons A, B, and C around the table so that they can bring their own perspectives on the data, so that perceptions of bias are removed and you have greater buy-in. So I think that there's definitely room to connect the areas that have and the areas that don't. Talking about geographical location, I think there's lots of room for bridge building.
I want to hear from Jana also on this, because we're opening ourselves up to criticisms of colonialism, right? Where do these ideas come from? And are they transferable? Would they be better transferable if they didn't come from certain sources? Jana, what do you think?
I would say that yes, the word gender, or the sort of the framing of gender, is certainly coming from a very certain specific Eurocentric origin, maybe. But I think the idea of gender equality or basic human rights, which is essentially what we're talking about, I think is certainly to me, that's certainly universal value and a universal approach, and nothing that should be limited with only being relevant or sort of only being something that you could dismiss by framing it as colonial or something. I think that's often something that tries to distract from efforts to make visible some of the power dynamics, some of the inequalities, some of the barriers that have been constructed. I think gender has this amazing trick of appearing natural. It's the way in which power structures and inequalities make themselves appear to be the only natural way in which society can be organized. And that goes a little bit back to the point on peer exchange being really useful for this, because by bringing people together from different contexts, we can really make visible how different dynamics of inequalities seem natural in one society are very different in another society, and how shallow that framing really is, and these understandings. So yes, I definitely support the work to facilitate peer exchange, both in terms of sharing experiences in making visible what seems natural, or sort of the natural way of organizing things. Also for building solidarity, because it can be a tiring and lonesome fight at times. So it's good to see the global picture and to realize that this is not just happening in one place, in one institution, in one classroom, but these are discussions, these are struggles that are happening all over the world in many different contexts, shaped by different social expectations and religions and languages and cultures. And it's all the fight for basic human rights, essentially, that we're talking about.
And I think one of the things that I have learned is actually kind of thinking about my privilege, and actually how do I pay that forward, and actually be aware of that, and then also making the other person in the room feel like they're being listened and they've been heard. So for instance, sometimes when I've gone to, say, the global south or to Africa or somewhere else, and they'll say to me, but you don't understand this. I'll say, no, I don't. But actually, you know what? Women in Britain before the pandemic were paid 23% less than men, nearly a quarter less than men. So we're still fighting for equality. We're still fighting for equal pay. I did an event with Saudi Arabia some years ago, and they were talking about that it was a criminal offence for women to be paid less than men. But then I kind of turned it around and asked them to say, well, actually, okay, that's great that women have been paid equal, but actually how many of those women are really allowed to go to work? How many of those women who were trained to be a doctor, allowed to be a doctor, and they were like, oh, but she wants to be home now and be a wife and she wants to have children. So it's about understanding your audience. It's about having an honest conversation, also kind of holding on to that humanity of yourself and respecting people, and by allowing people to have their say and talk about their kind of challenges and the barriers that they're facing locally. So as I always say, it's not always about thinking globally, but it's about acting locally and looking at actually how can we all get around the table? How do we have this conversation? And actually then sort of saying to people in, say, the MENA region or say the global south, that the world is very diverse now. People are very different, you know, they come with lots of different genders, and even though you may not be ready to accept that, but we need to have that conversation. And it's about being sensitive and kind of like you said, Sven, about talking to grassroots, getting them involved at the table first, and then they can feed that message down, getting young people involved, use social media, use tech, use what other means you can to get those messages out there, and creating safe spaces for people to be able to get the right information and not the wrong information, because actually, as much as the internet and everywhere is great to get your information, sometimes it's not factual and it's not right.
And I think this is what brings us also back to the educators, this medium for communication, including, of course, teaching students how to assess information in the right way. So since we have a room that kind of bridges this often separation between educators and NGOs and civil society, how would you imagine the best approach to get educators, if we agree that this is one of the important mediums, to participate in this gender transformative education? What can we do?
Perhaps I can start that one, Caroline, if you're all right with that. I tend to think of this as a process, and I say to my students, every intervention, because many of them will go off and work in policy making, or they'll work in development, or whatever the case might be. So I say to them, every intervention's got to have an impact, or will have an impact, whether you like it or not. Positive or negative is up to how you design it and how you implement it. So we have to consider gender at every sort of step of the way, and I use this terminology of the gender impact cycle, and I say to them, now let us look at what it means to be gender sensitive, what does it mean to be gender responsive, and what does it mean to be gender transformative. You can't have one without the other, because you've got to first get to point A before you can get to point B, before you can get to point C. And if, in my brief experience, you lay this out for them, you give them, like I say, a workable scenario, they work with it and they say, okay, this is what we identify as gender responsive, which is great, because then they understand just because it's policy doesn't necessarily mean that it's a reality. There's still work to be done before it can become a reality. So I think this systemic process or cycle, if one can teach them that, and they become aware and they're able to identify either the nature of an intervention or the progress that an intervention has made, we've already won, I won't say half the battle, but some of the battle. Because quite often when you start, and I made that mistake when I entered sort of the realm of gender scholarship, was I started using those terms interchangeably, and somebody knocked me on the head and said, no, these are actually part of a broader process, but they could never explain to me what that process was. So I went about it a different way, and I said, well, if I'm going to teach this, and if I'm going to incorporate it into my own research, let's try and build a process around this. And in some cases, it's been successful. I mean, if you look at the UNDP, for example, they have a toolkit for gender responsive communications. And I've designed one for Afrocentric approaches to counterterrorism evaluation through a gendered lens, where I use the same process. So I think one can have that connection. but one needs to use that cycle, and one needs to acknowledge that these various terms actually interlink with one another. They belong together. One cannot necessarily replace the other. They are realities. They are stages within a cycle, within a process that we must try and identify and ultimately achieve.
Thank you so much. I don't know if Mandy or Jana want to comment on this still?
I think you've made some really good points. I mean, I just wanted to hear from Jana. I don't know if she wanted to say anything before I kind of go in. Yeah.
I wanted to add, yes, so I think that spectrum is super helpful. I use it a lot when we're designing programming interventions and thinking about the impacts and sort of what level of impacts we're aiming at. I think what it's really helpful is making clear that you can't, that how insufficient it is to do some of these more cosmetic efforts at gender mainstreaming, which basically includes sort of sprinkling women over the top on an analysis, on a process, on a program, on a panel discussion, kind of add a few women and stir, and then gender equality happens. So it doesn't happen like this. You need to really look at these underlying systemic structures and inequalities, and then address those specifically targetedly. And that goes back to, I think, to leadership, to individuals, to making visible some of the systems and procedures that perpetuate it. For educators, I think whether you're looking then at inside the classroom or more at the community level, it means a certain degree of self-reflection and challenging of implicit bias amongst the educators. It's about looking at the curriculum, how it's written, what language does it use, what are the teaching materials used, the pictures, the imagery, the language, how you're measuring the progress and the impact of the training, sort of how is that being assessed. I think those are all challenges that I've encountered in the past and that I think are important to look more when we're looking at this, whether it's at the kind of community level around the body tree or in a university with in tertiary education.
And I also think it's also, I mean, we have talked about best practice and things like that, but it's actually also about creating like mentors and sponsors and that to actually carry on with this conversation in the classrooms, to actually champion this. And actually, so it's fair in your class, if somebody's doing a degree, actually, if they wanted to, they couldn't think about writing a paper or doing the research and getting people involved in the conversation, because it's kind of going back to the people that we want to be involved in the conversation. So it's about passing the power back to them to take control. And if that's through their learning and them taking control, going out and doing the research, doing the papers, doing the academic work for us, that's then what we kind of need to do. And I think that's one way of getting the buy-in globally as well, maybe.
Absolutely. And I think the classroom is just the starting point, but I always say experience is the ultimate teacher. I can only go so far. I introduce you to frameworks, I introduce you to concepts, to methodologies, to theories, but what you do with those is up to you. So to that end, I often adopt a very practical approach to my education. And what I did with my gender students this year is I actually got hold of the Swedish ambassador, who's a very, very good friend of mine here. And I said to him, well, could we have a dialogue? I understand it's a small group of students, so only about 8 or 9 students. Could we have a dialogue with you on the concept of feminist foreign policy, what it actually means, and the challenges and the successes you've encountered or lessons learned when implementing it on the ground? Because quite often what happens is you go into a classroom, you give these students these ideas, you give them the historical background, you give them all the ammo basically for a good start, and then they think, oh, I'm ready to go. I can change the world. I'm on top of the world. I'm going to change it within the next 5 years. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And then when they start trying to make a difference and things don't go according to plan for whatever rhyme or reason, primarily because they don't have enough practical experience, then they become discouraged. They consider perhaps paths that are different, that are perhaps a little bit easier. So, you know, with this dialogue, obviously you have diplomats that then promote their foreign policy and their interests, and, you know, one has to always guard against that. But when we did sort of the post-dialogue reflective discussion a few days after the fact, a lot of them spoke up and said, well, I actually did not realize how difficult it was going to be to promote such a policy or such a framework, you know, in a place like Afghanistan or, you know, North Africa or wherever. You know, so it was a bit of a reality check. So as much as educators are at the forefront of this, I think educators should also be mindful of the need to build those bridges between the classroom and the real world, because it doesn't help you teaching in this bubble.
100%. And I think we've seen things, sorry.
No,
and I think one of the things I have seen is that actually, you know, like different levels of education for women. So like we've seen in certain countries, soon as a girl gets into puberty, 11, 12's pulled out of school, she's not allowed to go. So, and then we'll go to other parts of the world and people have, you know, got degrees and masters and PhDs and things like that. And then they kind of trying to navigate the world. And it's kind of really interesting because I meet activists and campaigners and from all over the world with different levels of education. And sometimes, you know, the ones that have pulled out of school and they've got real life experience, sometimes they've seen things and done things very differently and able to share. And it is about sort of matchmaking and bringing people together and actually sort of helping the students and showing them, look, actually, here's a person very similar age group to you whose life has been somewhat different, but actually she's able to give you real life experiences and really talk about those challenges, about how it is about navigating around the world. I mean, when we think about gender-based violence, we think about America, about the abortion laws more just recently and things overturning. And, you know, sometimes we can kind of use that to our advantage when we're having conversations in other parts of the world to say, well, actually, do you know what? We are still making mistakes around gender and around equality and around certain issues. So, you know, we're learning from you as well. And I think when you're honest with people, you're going to get a lot more buy-in as well, instead of us coming in and thinking we know everything and we're the professionals, we're the teachers, we're the professors, and we're going to alienate people, I think. And that's just my own opinion.
And it is the right opinion, I will say that.
We actually had a question by one of the audiences about this topic in the chat. I'll just read out the question if you haven't seen it. There has been a lot of backsliding in some gender equality issues recently, so including the abortion rights, hatred towards trans communities, and so on. So do you see these as inevitable but surmountable reactions to progress in terms of gender equality, or do you see them as significant barriers to continued progress? Anybody would like to comment on that?
Does anybody else want to?
I would say they're not actually, well, it's not either or really. I would say there are significant barriers to continued progress, but it's also, we're seeing this backlash because so much work has been done, so much attention has been raised. But I think certainly looking at the global reaction to the world, feminist and feminism in general, notwithstanding the recent efforts at bringing in more feminist foreign policies, generally that word causes so much backlash, which I think we've seen in all of the different contexts. It just goes to show that we need so much more work to really get at least one place in the world where we could really say we've done it. Because I think at the moment, there's not really any country, despite over 50 years of working on gender issues, that where we could really say, oh, we can sit back here and say this is it. There's countries that have achieved a lot and have much better gender indicators than a lot of other places, for sure. But I think there's no place yet where we can say we're done.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because when we have these conversations. I mean, we go to global conferences. I mean, UN Women last year, even through the pandemic, created something in Paris, the Generation Equality, and all those other things, that things will happen, and these big things will happen every so often. We come out with a great new campaign, and we get a lot of people excited. But actually, it's not about keep dressing up the same thing again. This is about actually having a really honest conversation, talking about the barriers, the challenges, and actually sort of like being very clear about issues. You know, these are, you know, oppression of women and whatever else, especially when it comes around to abortion. It's very difficult when it's like people will say, well, it's my religion, it's my culture. It's when I'm talking about child marriage or FGM or other harmful cultural practices. It's about then saying, well, actually, it's not really religious, it's more cultural. But I guess abortion is a very tricky one because, you know, it's about treading carefully, but it's also about that people have a right to do what they want to with their bodies. You know, and we had something a few years ago, which I was involved in. The UK had a vote on selection abortions, where we knew that women from a certain ethnicity were aborting the child, knowing it was a girl, and going abroad to have abortions. And, you know, the law was not clear. It was like, who do you prosecute? Do you prosecute the woman? Do you prosecute the doctor? Who do you prosecute? And if somebody's been put under pressure and duress to say that go through with that termination, because we've already got a daughter, we don't want another one, we only want an heir. You know, it was very, very difficult. And I kind of had to really get around a table, not just with MPs, but with health professionals, educators, advocates and campaigners, religious groups and everybody else. And I was saying to them, look, I'm pro-choice, and, you know, everyone should be able to do what they want to do. But actually, if somebody's been put under pressure, duress, and being forced to have an abortion, or been told they can't have an abortion or something like that, then we don't have a right to do that to somebody. Because, like, we, you know, if somebody's been a victim of a sexual assault or incest, or, you know, a child been raped and things like that, and then you're the one that, you know, I've been to South America, where women actually get, you know, into trouble and facing criminal, you know, sort of go into prison because they want to have an abortion and things like that, you know. And we're going down that route in certain parts of the West as well. And it's about like having a very honest conversation. And I think the point that you made, Jana, we're human beings before we're anything else, before we're a woman, a man, or whatever we identify ourselves as. We belong to one race, it's human. And, you know, if we can't control what we want to do with our lives and the way that we want to live them, or how we want to identify, then we've got a long way to go. But as educators and professionals, we've got to create a safe space and allow people to have an open, honest conversation. And not just about a safe space, but it's also, if we are creating safe space, knowing who the audience are, who are the people in that room listening in. Are there people who are also linked to other religious groups and things? Are they going to go back and report Jana for disclosing something in a safe space and things like that? So I think that we have a lot to do, and I don't think we could sort this out in one conversation. I think this is just a really important conversation to be had, and it's a beginning, I guess.
Well, we're getting to the end of our hour. I don't know if there's any famous last words that Jana or Sven, you would like to add? Then
that was a really good wrapping up, actually. Yeah.
I agree. Thank you so much. I think you know, the natural process here is to let you know that everything that we're talking about, this is really going to be shared with our community of educators at you know, in the MBA in Educational Leadership at Tampere University. So we're speaking straight to the people who are the mediators, the educators, but it's also going to be used by Professors Without Borders to frame the pedagogical approach to issues around gender transformative education, educating the educators, and this goes, of course, to countries all around the world. So I think it's really the beginning of a very difficult discussion, which I'm really happy to see that we are having. As we know, this is an emerging trend, emerging meaning new, with a lot of things that we can add to. And I think if we had the same conversation, or at least the same topic of conversation 10 years from now, I hope that would have very different content. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Oscar, I'll let you have the last word.
No, thank you. Thank you so much to all our speakers for a really insightful conversation. I think 1 hour felt like a very short time. I wish we could have gone on for another hour or two, or even a week. But yeah, I think when Tessy opened, the discussion 1 hour ago, one of the questions she posted was, like, is this gender transformative education just a buzzword? Like just, actually empty in meaning? Like something that has been created just for the sake of more conversation. I think we can conclude as part of the from this discussion that there is still a lot to be done, and this probably new dimension helps like to hold those conversations and take it to the classroom or wherever those conversations need to be happening. So, but yeah, thank you so much to everybody, and look forward to continuing the conversation later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.